Chapter 28, Breaking Ground. After trying to call Kaha, my other priority was to get in touch with Eminem to meet and discuss how we start working together. Rojo told me that Eminem agreed to work with me, but we still needed to sit down and discuss the details. When I finally got a hold of him, Eminem offered to make the drive all the way out to Ukiah. The first time we met, bear in mind this was in 1999, he drove up in a brand new 1999 Mercedes-Benz, sitting on 22-inch rims with the dealership plate still on it. He was definitely the flamboyant type, into the flash and dressed like a little baller or a high-level drug dealer. When we sat down, I laid out my circumstances. I was trying to break ground in this area, was in the beginning stages of establishing a regiment. My boy Wormy had the clientele locked in, and I needed the first pound fronted to me. I told him that once I flipped it, I'd pay him back for the front, and then I'd have enough to buy my own. The only issue we had was the 2.5-hour commute going each way from Ukiah to Oakland. I was on parole, so I'd be taking unnecessary chances making that trip. And it wasn't his practice to do deliveries, even within the Oakland area. His idea was to introduce me to another NR member by the name of Frank Pancho Camacho out of Santa Rosa, who was already working with him. Santa Rosa was more or less the intersector between Oakland and Ukiah. So when I needed to re-up, I could call Pancho and let him know what I needed. This way, they could do it all at the same time and kill two birds with one stone. Pancho would then have a female acquaintance make the half-hour-long drive to Ukiah once a week. Prior to Eminem leaving, he made a phone call to a friend of his who drove out there in another car and who was waiting a couple blocks away in a Safeway parking lot. He had this guy pull up in front of Melissa's house and hand me a pound of crystal meth, strictly on consignment. Then they left. Now all I had to do was call Wormy, bag the shit up, and start moving it. As soon as they left, I called Wormy and told him I was on my way over. Due to me being on parole, I wanted to get it out of the house as soon as possible, but I also wanted to start making money because at the time, I was barely getting by. When I got to Wormy's apartment, he had a friend named Rob who lived in the same apartment complex and said we could cut it and bag it at his place. He said Rob was cool and would probably want a teener, 1.7 grams, or a couple lines. Rob was a white guy in his mid-30s who made a living by managing the apartment complex they lived in and also installing DirecTV satellite dishes. I took a liking to Rob real quick. He even wanted to start working with us on a small scale. Rob indicated he knew people who were good for 8 balls or teeners every now and then. So I gave him 4 8 balls and set a price where we both still make a worthwhile profit. Since this was the first pound Eminem fronted me, I wanted to maximize my profits and double my money. So we cut it all up into 8 balls and teeners. This way, I could pay Eminem back for the pound on consignment, plus make enough to buy at least another half pound of my own and still have money to spend. The upside about dumping dope in Ukiah was that the prices were a lot higher out there and the market was wide open. Crystal meth was the new crack epidemic of the 90s and a lucrative commodity. At the time, an 8 ball went for about $100 in the Bay Area, but $200 to $250 in Ukiah, and people were happy with that price. The other dope out there was garbage, so if Eminem kept up the quality, we'd make a killing. The benefit of working with Wormy was that he knew everybody out there. He'd already been living in Ukiah for a couple years, and his resources and contacts were everywhere. Being of Pomo Indian descent, Wormy also knew everyone on the Indian reservations, and this is where most of the money was at. Most of these Indians, who were official registrants with their tribes, used to get monthly allotments from the casinos called cap money. This was money the casinos made in profits, and then divided it up amongst all the tribe members. A good majority of the youngsters who lived on the reservation were meth addicts. This benefited us and offered huge potential. Wormy brought one of his friends by, Brad, a white guy who we worked with. Brad was good for 8 to 10 8 balls a week. I put him in pocket and got him to start working with us. Within a month, I went from selling drugs on the retail level to the wholesale level. It went so fast, I'd run out before I could get Pancho to send his driver. Occasionally, Pancho would drive out there himself, but most of the time, he sent his homegirl. Before starting, I was practically living off of Melissa's income, but now I had 3 nice cars, a full wardrobe, and a house full of toys. I ate flat TV, screen TV, new appliances, new furniture, computer equipment, etc., etc. The fast money became addicting. Within a couple months, we pretty much had the whole county sold up. By now, Wormy and I became real close. He was the only homeboy in Ukiah that I could depend on and trust when it really came down to it. I eventually started working with Pep, his primo Chito, and some of the other youngsters they introduced me to. But Wormy was more on my level and the only one knowledgeable about the things we were really involved in. As time went on, I also got to know his girlfriend Vicky and her teenage son Rudy. Occasionally, Melissa, Wormy, Vicky, Rudy, Melissa's 3 boys, and I would go out to Lake Mendocino or barbecue at Vicky's friend Nadine's house. Vicky was a very attractive woman, something that stood out to me from the first time I met her. But this was my homeboy's lady, and I never even thought about crossing that line. As attractive as she was, I just wouldn't disrespect him like that because I considered him to be like a brother. But as I got to know both of them, it became obvious their relationship was beginning to suffer a lot of problems. At one point or another, they both came to me for advice. I was comfortable talking to Wormy about it when he needed my support. But when Vicky would show up crying by herself, I didn't know how to handle it. I felt like I was intruding on Wormy's space and overstepping my boundaries. But I also considered her a friend, so I never turned her away. Over time, Wormy expressed his concerns that Vicky was having an affair, but his venting turned into inquiries. It was obvious he thought she was having an affair with me, but that wasn't so. Wormy never came right out and said it, but he didn't need to. His insinuations spoke for themselves. Nonetheless, it became a sensitive area that we both avoided. It even got a little awkward when we'd all go out together. I could tell Vicky had feelings for me because I caught all the looks. All the signs were there, but I still kept my distance and never went there. Toward the beginning of 2000, I got a phone call from NF member Robert Chico Rose from Salinas. He'd just gotten out and wanted to arrange a meeting to discuss all the things we talked about in prison. Chico said he wanted to drive out to my place and spend the night. He came out later that week with 2 other homeboys, Gabe, G Money Caracheo, and Johnny Night Owl Martinez from Salinas. Night Owl was an NR member working under Chico. When they showed up, we sat around drinking beer and talked about how we could begin networking our 2 regiments. At the time, Chico didn't have a steady mess supplier, so I offered to call Eminem and see if he'd be willing to work with them in Salinas. If Eminem had that kind of weight, I was almost positive he'd be interested. Even though a possible downside existed in working with regiments plagued with politics, at least it was guaranteed money, and the manpower had potential to move a lot of weight. Chico had 4,000 and didn't need a front, which was positive in his favor. He wanted Eminem to hook him up and start working with him to get the regiment Salinas back on track. Since Smiley and Lobo had gotten busted, their regiment never really recuperated, and MC's murder pushed a lot of the homeboys away. Nobody wanted to do anything with the regiment, and some people had actually turned completely away from the NF. That night, Chico, Gabe, Night Out, and I also talked about robbing the same casino where Melissa worked at. She knew the whole layout and the inside schematics. Melissa worked security in the surveillance booth, on the floor, and in the vault. Over time, I had pretty much gathered enough information to where I felt like we might actually be able to pull it off. I told Chico I'd get back at him about it when I was ready, but we would need 2-way radios, squelchers, and a lot of planning before we decided to do it. The following morning after we got up, I called Pancho and made arrangements for him and Chico to meet up in Santa Rosa. Pancho talked to Eminem and agreed to give Chico a pound for the 4,000, with an agreement that he'd give him another 2,000 later. Then they left. This was the last time I'd ever see or speak to Chico again. By now, I was turning huge profits, ready to start making contributions to the organization and meet a set quota. I was sending $300 to $400 to Big Rock and Conejo here and there, but now I was ready to start sending $3,000 to $4,000 to the organization's main bank. Within a week after writing Big Rock, requesting an address to begin making deposits, I got a call from NF member Louis Big Roach Oroche from San Francisco, advising me that he needed to see me as soon as possible. He had a new set of directives from Conejo, and there were urgent filters that I needed to read that pertained to my primary channel. At the time, my primary channel was still Big Rock. Big Roach said these matters couldn't wait and that he'd drive out to my place the next day. Being that he had just paroled, I knew that these directives were all updated and current. When I had him on the phone, I told him it would be a good idea for me to call Eminem and have him drive out there as well, since Big Rock was overseeing Alameda County and Eminem was already working with that regiment. I also told him that it would be a good opportunity for them to meet on a business level, especially if Big Roach wanted to tap into those resources. The next day, I called Eminem and told him to drive out there by himself so we could get together with Big Roach and discuss issues that apparently involved Big Rock. The next morning, Eminem arrived first. I utilized this time to reinforce our business arrangement and advise him as to the potential in Mendocino County. If we play our cards right, we were sitting on a gold mine. Within an hour, Big Roach called and he said he was just pulling into Ukiah and would be at my place within a few minutes. When he finally arrived, he handed me a manila envelope that contained 4 huge bundles of micro-written filters and directives from Conejo. There was a lot of extremely hot material that would take me a while to read, so I gave it to Melissa to hide somewhere in her mom's room. Since I was on parole, I was subject to random searches at any time, which extended only to our room and common areas of the house. Her mom's room was supposed to be off limits since she had a lock on her door, and this was where I wanted it secured. When we all finally sat down, Big Roach told me to cease all communications with Big Rock because it was discovered he had been working with law enforcement, supposedly as far back as when I was celled up with him, and possibly even as far back as when he was the UC, unit commander in C-11. This could have been the reason why all of us were moved, only the NF members, to C2 after Gato and Spider had locked it up. Maybe Big Rock wanted to maneuver his way closer to Stork, Corny, Tex, and Bad Boy to put himself in a better position to gather more info. Big Roach said it was only by chance they found out about Big Rock's defection and nobody had any idea what he was doing. Supposedly, he was communicating with law enforcement by mail, as he obviously couldn't get out of his cell much without raising suspicion. Apparently, one of his letters came back as a return to sender, but the letter was inadvertently given to an MA member who had the same name as Big Rock. The MA member, in turn, shot the letter to Stork so as to show him what Big Rock was doing. Had that not occurred, there's no telling how long this could have gone on for, and the damage would have undoubtedly been worse. Conejo was reinstated as my primary channel, and I was being instructed to assist Big Roach and Eminem with establishing the Oakland and San Francisco regiments. Big Roach had been at sea longer than me, but by now I had a lot more hands-on experience with the street affairs and had been functioning in regiments off and on for almost 7 years. Once Big Roach finished telling me about Big Rock and other changes that had occurred in the Bay, I told him about NF member Mark Caja Rodriguez and the issues involving Lefty. Based on his actions and the phone call I had with him, I told Big Roach that I didn't trust him and I got bad feelings about what he might be up to out there in the San Jose area, especially because of what he said about Brown Bob's murder in the grand jury. In my mind, anytime someone offers an explanation about something out of the blue and goes on a long, unnecessary spiel about it for no apparent reason, it raises red flags and usually means they're hiding something. After we finished covering all the issues of importance and the other business issues, they both left and headed back. Eminem was now supplying Mendocino County, San Francisco, Oakland, and Salinas. At the time, Wormy was technically the only NR member who I considered an actual member of my regiment. Everybody else was considered outsiders and had no idea they were actually assisting an NF regiment. I had to improvise and utilize all the resources around me, Rob, Brad, and some of the others working with me weren't even Northerners. My objective was to generate money for the NF, to break ground, and to establish new territory. And that's exactly what I did. It didn't really matter that I wasn't operating under the traditional structure that a regiment is usually built and established under. All that mattered was that I was making money and being productive for the organization. The only downside about operating unconventionally without actual NR members or Norteños as manpower was that I didn't have the monthly $200 commissions coming in. Customarily, with committed manpower, each member is required to pay $200 monthly off the top, regardless of how much money the regiment is generating. This money goes back to the organization and is accounted for. If I report to my channel that I have 15 members working under my regiment, they'd expect $3,000 for the commission on top of whatever set quota I was expected to meet. The other profits were generated on a sliding scale, but under the circumstances, I had to pick up the slack and make do with the resources available to me. In retrospect, this was probably better because it eliminated a lot of bullshit that normally has to be dealt with. It was better for me, as Wormy was the only one who knew we were running a regiment. The day after Big Roach left, Rob came over to help me install a window-mounted air conditioner at Melissa's place. It used to get up into the high 90s and the heat was miserable out there. After we spent most of the afternoon putting it in, I got a call from someone who wanted 4 8-balls but didn't have a ride to meet me down the street at the usual designated location. I told Rob to give me a ride to Wormy's carport where we kept the dope stashed in his storage locker and then drive me to meet this customer. After we picked up the dope, we started to drive to the intersection of Gobi and South State Street. As we were slowing down at the red light, I noticed a Ukiah PD cruiser at the intersection waiting to make a left turn. Rob apparently spotted him at the same time because he looked up and said, "Oh shit, I don't have any tags." I don't know why he didn't just tell me this earlier or why I didn't notice. I said, "Don't panic, just drive cool, bro." When the light turned green, we proceeded through the intersection just as the squad car made its turn and ended up directly behind us. Now I was starting to become concerned because if he didn't have tags, there was a good chance they were going to notice it now. As we drove, I told Rob to turn in the Safeway parking lot, hopefully to shake the cops. But as soon as we made the turn, they lit us up. I had the 4 8-balls in my hand and I knew they definitely searched me since I was on parole. I told Rob to grab them and stuff them down his pants. But he was already panicking and instead opened the center console and threw the dope inside. Before I could react, they were at our windows telling us to exit the vehicle. I knew they'd find the dope and now I was pissed at Rob. I just looked at him while we sat there cuffed up. Not even 5 minutes after they started searching, they had all the dope in small piles on top of the hood of Rob's truck. One of the cops came over to me and asked, "Whose dope is it?" I just dummied up and said, "What dope?" When they asked Rob the same question, I looked at him again and told him under my breath, "You better take that shit. I'm a 3-striker, fool." At that time, he didn't say nothing, but he looked back at me and said, "Okay, don't trip." Even though I was a 3-striker, I really wasn't worried about it too much, regardless of what Rob said. Why should I be? It wasn't my truck. I wasn't driving, and it wasn't in my possession. There's no way they could pin that shit on me. At least that's what I thought. When Rob and I were finally transported to the police station, he held true to his word. He gave a statement claiming that the dope was his and said that I had no knowledge of it. They even bottled us, gave us urinalysis tests before they took us to the jail, but I wasn't worried about that either because I was clean. Despite the extenuating factors in my favor, and even though Rob had incriminated himself, they still refused to cut me loose and charged us both. The reason for this was undoubtedly none other than because of who I was and not wanting to pass up an opportunity to wash me up. The following morning, after I got to the jail, I called the parole supervisor, Jerry Cardoza, and gave him all the details of my arrest and the circumstances surrounding the flimsy case that they had charged me with. Cardoza told me that he was waiting for a copy of the police report, and once he got it, he let me know exactly what they were going to do. I knew I was going to get hit with the parole violation at the very least, especially since they had a zero-tolerance policy when it came to high-control parolees. But I figured it still wouldn't hurt to plead my case and see what happened. When I called Melissa later that same day, she told me that the task force and parole had gone by, searched the house, and they had completely turned the whole house upside down. She said they fucking thrashed everything. They even went through the kids' stuff. I said, but they didn't find anything, right? She said, listen to me. They found that micro stuff, and they said that they knew it was yours. For a minute, I was stuck on this and didn't understand what she was trying to tell me. I was thinking that maybe they found small traces of residue on one of the dressers since she said micro stuff. But even that seemed unlikely because it had been a while since I brought any dope in the house. I was confused. Then she said, remember your friend that came up in the red truck from San Francisco and gave you that stuff that you told me to hide in my mom's room? That's when I realized she was talking about the 4 bundles of kites that Big Roach had dropped off. I had forgotten all about them. I said, fuck. What did they say? And why did they search your mom's room if she had a lock on her door? She said, my mom's room wasn't locked when they came in, so they said that gave them authorization to search it. Then she said they told her, see this, holding up the bundles of kites? This right here is going to get him in a lot of trouble. Now I knew I was definitely going to get violated, and I knew that there wasn't really much I could say about it. The only thing I could say was that I had brought that paperwork out with me from Pelican Bay when I paroled the first time, and that I shouldn't be penalized for it since it was outdated. That's all I could say. This really didn't hold any weight, but all I could do now was wait and see what happened. Since Rob had kept his word, I had Melissa bail him out and gave him $5,000 to pay for a private attorney. The only thing I asked him to do was to go down to the parole office and tell Cardoza that I didn't know nothing about the dope and that he was just giving me a ride. After he bailed out and Melissa told me that he had already been by the parole office, I called Cardoza to see what he had to say. When I got him on the phone, he said he was on his way down to the jail to talk to me and would let me know what was going on once he got there. I knew he wasn't coming all the way down there to give me good news. I just figured he was probably going to try to ask me about the kites that the task force found. When he finally got to the jail about an hour later, I was just about to tell him that I brought that paperwork out with me the first time I paroled. But before I could say anything, he said, I'm lifting the hold and I'm going to COP you, continue you on parole. I couldn't believe it. He was actually going to cut me loose. All kinds of things started going through my head. How was he going to cut me loose after they found that hot paperwork? Maybe the task force hadn't told parole about it yet, but parole was there. They had to have known about it. Maybe I just wasn't catching on to something. My luck just wasn't that good. Then it dawned on me. They weren't doing me any favors. They were just giving me more rope to hang myself. They had ulterior motives, and it didn't have anything to do with my best interest. Of course, parole knew about that paperwork, and this was probably the reason behind it. Maybe it was the feds who wanted me cut loose. When I got out later that night, I called Rob and told him to come over to my place the next morning. Since he had gotten arrested, I hadn't had the opportunity to really talk to him. Now I wanted to pick his brain and find out exactly what happened from the minute we had gotten arrested and everything that happened since then. This would give me a clear perspective to evaluate how strong the case was against me, and it would also give me and Rob an opportunity to agree on exactly how we were going to handle it. After talking to Rob, it became clear that he was already starting to waver and was having second thoughts about taking the case. His whole thing was not wanting to plead guilty to a possession for sale because he wouldn't be able to get his record expunged later. He said he'd plead guilty to a simple possession, but that the DA wasn't willing to do that. Here I was looking at 25 to life if I got convicted for any felony, and all this dude was worried about was clearing his fucking record. I was upset that he wasn't even contemplating this, considering what I was looking at. But there was nothing I could do. I was so upset I wanted to beat his ass right there and actually thought about it. But I had to play my cards right and keep my wits about this. After all this, he had the audacity to tell me that his attorney wanted another 5 G's to settle the case. I wasn't about to help him with shit, especially if I wasn't sure about his position or what he was going to do. He told me he talked to his lawyer and get back to me about it. So we basically walked away from the conversation undecided and everything was still up in the air. Since Wormy knew him better than me, and this was his boy, I called Wormy and told him to talk some sense into Rob and to get him to commit to seeing this through. Otherwise, we might be forced to resort to extreme measures. Wormy went by Rob's apartment later that night and ended up having to threaten him because Rob was still hung up on keeping his record clean. But according to what Wormy told me, Rob finally decided to pull his head out his ass and take the case. About a week after I got released, I was standing outside in front of the house early one morning when I saw Jerry Cardoza and 2 Ukiah PD patrol cars heading straight for our place. Melissa had just left for work about 2 minutes before they pulled into the small parking lot where we were living, and now I saw that she had also doubled back and was trying to beat them to the house. I watched her as she sped up in front of Cardoza, cut him off, jumped out the car, and then ran into the house, like a trooper. As soon as she was inside, I heard the door lock. I knew what she was doing. This girl had my back. She was on top of it because she knew that this was one of the very few times that I had dope in the house. I was waiting for Pep to come by that morning and pick it up, and she remembered that. She wanted to get back and get rid of the dope. Later, she would actually tell me that when she was driving out, she saw Cardoza and asked him if he was going by to see me, and he told her no. Knowing that there wasn't anyone else on parole in that area, she knew he was lying. Needless to say, Cardoza and the cops were livid because she wouldn't let them in the house until she was done flushing the dope. She told them later that she did this because she didn't want them to come in and scare the kids and that she wanted to get them out of bed. But I knew what she was really doing, and she saved my ass that day. When I first saw Cardoza pulling up that morning, I assumed he was coming to do a parole search, or that maybe he had just found out about the true contents of that paperwork, the kites. Whatever it was, I knew it was definitely me they were looking for, and because of the 2 squad cars, I knew it couldn't be good. When Cardoza stepped out of his vehicle, he pulled out a pair of handcuffs and said, "I'll let you know what's going on in a minute, but first I need to cuff you up." After he put me in cuffs, he told me that the district attorney was upset with them for releasing me. They had to put me back in custody and violate me for the case I had pending. This was some bullshit, but I knew my luck wasn't that good. I couldn't believe it. They were actually going to violate me because the DA was upset. That didn't sound like a viable reason to lock me back up, but there was nothing I could do. On top of violating me for the possession of meth for sale, they also slapped another violation on me for gang activity. This stemmed from an excessive amount of children's red clothing that they considered to be gang related. According to them, since I was prohibited from wearing any red attire, I was purposely draping the kids in red clothing to inadvertently flag my colors through them. This was ridiculous. It was obviously just another reason to lock me up. The parole board would later dismiss this violation, agreeing that this was a frivolous, trumped-up charge, but nonetheless, this is how low they stooped to throw me back in jail. When Rob and I were finally scheduled to go to our preliminary hearing, I knew that this was where they were more than likely going to drop the case against me. They had to, because this is where all the evidence is weighed out to determine whether or not they have a strong enough case against you or bind you over for trial. I had everything in my favor. The truck was Rob's, he was driving, he incriminated himself, his urinalysis test came back positive for meth, and they found scales and drug paraphernalia in his apartment. On top of all that, my urinalysis test came back negative. They didn't find any scales or drug paraphernalia at my house. There's no way they could bind me over, but to my disbelief, they did. These people were definitely trying to railroad me, and they weren't playing fair. The judge's reasoning was based on the fact that the drugs were found in between where we were both sitting, and thus, this is considered constructive possession. Even this didn't sound right, in light of the overwhelming evidence they had against Rob, and the judge knew it. Now I was starting to worry, facing the prospect of a mandatory 25 years to life if they made anything stick. I dumped my public defender and hired my own private lawyer. Now I couldn't take any chances. As the case progressed, my attorney told me that he found out that parole was working hand in hand with the DA to build a stronger case against me. I wasn't surprised. They were actually going out in the field, interviewing people on the streets to see if they could find anyone who would say that I was selling drugs. They wanted to see me get washed up. Meanwhile, Rob moved out of his apartment and was now claiming that I had threatened to kill him if he didn't take the case. He was completely flipping the script on me. This dude was a cold piece of work. He was more than willing to let me spend the rest of my life in prison simply because he didn't want to cop out to his sales. And now, they were definitely going to play on this by parading me into the courtroom and portraying me to be some big, badass NF gang leader who was pressuring this little white guy. Rob looked the part too. I still had a lot of things in my favor, but this was starting to look ugly. One day when I was in my housing area playing pinochle, they called me over to the intercom and told me that I had an attorney interview. I wasn't expecting my attorney to come up, but we were working on the final touches of my upcoming 995 motion, so I just figured he wanted to go over it with me. When I walked out and opened the door to the attorney interview room, I saw two guys I'd never seen before sitting there at the table. One was a Mexican guy with a thick mustache, and the other one was a middle-aged white guy that had cop written all over him. The Mexican guy held his hand out and said, "Mendoza, hi, how you doing? Have a seat." I shook his hand, sat down and said, "Who are you guys?" The Mexican guy did all the talking. He identified himself by name and said that they were agents working with the Federal Bureau of Investigations. As soon as I heard that they were the feds, I said, "Nah, I don't think it's a good idea to talk to you guys." But the Mexican guy said, "You don't have to talk to us if you don't want to. We just came up here to warn you." I said, "Warn me about what?" He went on this long routine spiel about how they had information that I was in trouble with the NF, how they were going to hit me once I got back to prison, and how they were there to help me. From the onset, I knew that this was a scare tactic and that they were just trying to reel me in. I was familiar with this cat and mouse game and saw right through it. I stood up and said, "I ain't no trouble, and if I am, I'll take what I got coming, but I don't think talking to the feds is going to help me out in any way." As soon as I was getting ready to walk out, the white guy said, "Who's Colleen?" Without thinking, I said, "That's my girlfriend's mother. Why?" He said, "Do you always use her name when you write letters?" They threw this small crumb out there to get my attention, and it did. Colleen was the name I used whenever I write Big Rock or Conejo. Then the Mexican guy opened up a file folder that was sitting in front of him, long enough for me to see a stack of my photocopied letters that I had written to both Big Rock and Cornell. I also noticed that they used a yellow marker to highlight certain sections that they obviously assumed contained portions of hidden codes. Then he slammed it shut. I noticed that they had written John Boxer Mendoza on the folder tab. The Mexican guy said, "You should think about helping yourself because you're walking right underneath that massive avalanche that's about to bury you and all your boys real soon." Then he added, "Come on, man. Loyalty only goes so far. Look at what happened to Mike Eel." I said, "I'm good," and then I walked out. When I walked away from that interview room, I was more worried about getting indicted by the feds than I was about the case I was fighting. But I still wasn't going to talk to them, and there was nothing I could do about it. Whatever was going to happen would happen, so all I could do now was wait it out. Then I started thinking about the kites that the task force found. I didn't even get a chance to read them all. What if there were directives for me to whack someone or other sensitive directives that they could have used to hit me with the conspiracy with? Surely this had something to do with why these two guys came up to see me. About 2 weeks later, I went to court for my 995 motion. Even though it was a strong motion with strong actual points of contention, my attorney told me not to expect much out of it and that it would probably be just another day in court. He said that it was all procedural and that we were going to have to beat it in trial. For once, my luck was about to defy me and I was finally about to catch a break. The judge dismissed my case based on the merits of the motion and said that he had no choice considering the evidence that was before him. Even though it was the fair thing to do, I was still shocked. I never caught those kinds of breaks. Parole still ended up giving me a flat year, but considering the fact that I had just beaten a life case, I was happy with that. 2 weeks later, I was back on the bus, headed for San Quentin.